Chicago could have 1 million more residents without being overcrowded if we do it right. This would be good for businesses large and small, good for our institutions such as schools and churches, good for our ongoing viability as a city, and good for the environment. I'm a member of Urban Environmentalists Illinois, and we support dense housing development in places with access to transit. The central city as an environmental paradise is a new concept in the 21st century. From the dawn of the Industrial Revolution through deindustrialization, the city was home to steel mills, slaughterhouses, chemical plants, paint factories, bookbinders, and all manner of businesses that produced unpleasant sights and sounds and smells, as well as imperceptible environmental harm to the water and soil. But you can go to many erstwhile industrial corridors in Chicago, along Lake Street on the west side, 119th Street on the south side, the U.S. Steel property at 87th Street and the lakefront, and see that industrial pollution is way down, which is causing transportation as a share of emissions to rise. It's now 29% of emissions, according to the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning, and cars are the leading source of greenhouse gas emission. How does housing figure into this? As attempts to satisfy the need for reasonably priced housing are thwarted in the city and urban suburbs, they radiate bit by bit, eventually ending up in the hinterlands. Yorkville, Oswego, Sugar Grove, Wadsworth, Crown Point, Indiana. This is an environmental disaster. Ex-urban development disrupts wildlife habitat, destroys wetlands, increases impervious surfaces, and consumes more energy per person for heating and cooling. Plus, it increases vehicle miles driven by automobiles. According to the National Household Travel Survey, people in the sticks drive 10 miles more each day than people who live in central cities. And that's a national survey, which includes central cities in the Sun Belt, which are built like distant suburbs here. Locally, the contrast is sharper. Nationally, 92% of households have at least one car. In Chicago, it's about 73% of households, according to 2020 census estimates. Interestingly, according to an analysis by the chief economist of real estate listing service Trulia, in sprawl cities like Houston, car ownership correlates with household income. The higher the income, the more cars a household has. In traditional cities such as Chicago, there's some of that, but car ownership rates also depend on neighborhood density. The denser the neighborhood, the lower the rate of car ownership, irrespective of income. That's why we want to develop density here. You end up reducing use of the top polluter. Even if people do own cars in dense areas, the regularity with which they drive them and the distances they drive are significantly lower than on the edge of civilization. That's the environmental benefit. Urban Environmentalist Illinois is the local chapter of the national organization YIMBY Action. YIMBY stands for Yes in My Backyard. We are here to be a countervailing voice against the NIMBYs, the people who say not in my backyard. The NIMBYs, judging by the statements I hear, are often simply against change. Nostalgia is a common and powerful emotion, but their ostensible arguments indicate an attitude that residential and commercial density are bad. They still associate density with the teeming tenements of the 19th century, or 20th century public housing in Chicago, or third world countries with densely populated slums as far as the eye can see. Once someone has some success, they buy a car and move to a less dense residential area with trees and parks, a cleaner environment. But this process does nothing to improve the environment. It only spreads the environmental degradation. In America today, it is the slums that are disinvested and depopulated, and many of the dense neighborhoods have higher household incomes, higher educational attainment, and are certainly richer in resources and opportunities. A city such as Chicago depends on population for its tax base. The greater our population, the further divided among us is the cost of running our public institutions, schools, parks, libraries, police and fire departments. Sparsely populated bedroom suburbs, I believe, are not sustainable. Maybe they are in the North Shore, where wealthy people are willing to pay high property tax as a barrier against the hoi polloi. But as working class post-World War II suburbs here in the Chicago area and around the Midwest and Northeast face the end of the useful life of their school buildings, streets, water and sewer systems, the you-know-what is starting to hit the fan. They need upgrades or replacements, often to the tune of hundreds of millions, and the money just isn't there. Unlike bedroom suburbs, Chicago can have the necessary population to sustain itself if we would let it. Chicago reached its peak population of 3.6 million in 1950. It is now 2.6 million. We're down 27% in population. Where are all the empty homes? They do not exist. According to the American Community Survey, Chicago has 1.18 million households, exceeding the previous high of 1.16 million established in 1960. We have more households, more occupied dwelling units than ever before. Our loss in population is entirely due to smaller family size. A six flat that in 1950 might have had 50 people living in it now has 15 at a higher standard of living. A bigger, softer mattress, better appliances, big screen TV, internet. But our city won't grow unless we allow developers to build the housing that people want today. Kids just starting out don't want to live in a flop house, but they do want 600 square foot studios conveniently located and modestly priced. But it's not just the low end. For every mansion or penthouse we don't build, there's a wealthy family bidding up the price of the next level of housing down. We need more housing, both as replacement for housing that has aged out or fallen into disuse, and to attract new residents to increase our population. Unfortunately, our zoning code takes us in the other direction. Chicago enacted its first zoning code 101 years ago. The 12-unit building where I live was built before zoning. A lot of Chicago was built before zoning. This being Chicago, there is a significant racial component to the application of zoning. Chicago was once much more racially segregated than it is today, if you can believe it. In the early 20th century, individuals and the real estate industry used restrictive covenants, that is, a provision in the deed that prevented the sale of property to or occupancy by Black people, in order to keep Chicago segregated. 80% of Chicago homes were covered by restrictive covenants at some point. This persisted until 1948, when restrictive covenants were invalidated by the U.S. Supreme Court in a decision called Shelley versus Kramer, a case that arose from St. Louis. Then came the Fair Housing Act of 1968, which prohibits housing discrimination based on race, religion, national origin, sex, disability, and family status. After a half dozen court rulings, including Jones versus Mayer and Hunter versus Erickson, it became clear by the mid-1970s, remember that date, mid-1970s, that the law meant what it said and would be enforced, no housing discrimination. White residents and real estate interests and aldermen in Chicago gasped and said, "Oh my God, what are we going to do now to keep the colored people out?" One particular tool was downzoning, making the zoning single-family only, regardless of the existing uses. This makes housing scarcer and more expensive. The Metropolitan Planning Council is studying the history of zoning in Chicago. They've not yet released their report, but generally speaking, what they're finding is that downzoning took off in the mid-1970s. And it really went wild in the 1980s and 90s. In Chicago today, 52% of the city's land is zoned residential. And about 80% of that is single family only. You follow? 52% of the city is residential, and 80% of that residential is single family only. You don't see it because there's a lot of stuff that was built before it became single family only, and it exists as a non-conforming use. It is impossible now in large portions of Chicago to build an apartment building of any size without petitioning for and being granted a zoning change, which usually involves groveling before the alderman and subjecting oneself to community meetings, many of which I have personally observed to be only slightly less racist than a Ku Klux Klan rally. This is true even in neighborhoods with apartment buildings that predate the downzoning. This is the current situation. We have ideas. In addition to turning up at meetings and writing letters in support of specific developments, we have a legislative agenda. We are advocating allowing accessory dwelling units, which some people call granny flats or coach houses, in Chicago's residential zones. These would typically be an apartment upstairs from a garage. This provides an opportunity for a huge increase in, we hope, modestly priced homes, as well as an additional source of revenue for homeowners, many of whom feel pinched by property tax. We are in favor of allowing 3 flats by right in any residential zone in Chicago, and we are in favor of abolishing parking minimums, both residential and commercial. We also have an agenda in Springfield, which, if we're successful, would apply to all cities with a population over 100,000, which is 8 cities, allowing accessory dwelling units, allowing 2 flats by right in all residential zones, 2 flats, and ending parking mandates in areas that are well served by transit, meaning the location is within a half mile of a bus or train that runs every 15 minutes or better during peak times. While these legislative ideas are in various stages of pendency, we can claim victory on several specific housing development proposals that we actively supported, many of which overcame significant NIMBY opposition. 82 units on property that used to be a funeral home at 6750 North Northwest Highway. People are dying to get in there. 15 units replacing an existing single-family home at 5400 North Ashland Avenue. Unfortunately, the original proposal was 18 units, so the NIMBYs did succeed in telling 3 families to go fuck themselves. I hope they're pleased. 42 homes on the former Dinkles Bakery property at 3333 North Lincoln Avenue. 134 homes on the Royal George Theater property at 1641 North Halsted Street. 64 affordable units in a former bank building at 3959 North Lincoln Avenue, along with 130 market rate units in the former bank parking lot at 3950 North Damon Avenue, 355 homes at 2033 North Kingsbury Street, 40 homes at 2919 West Lawrence Avenue, and this just in, Alderman Bennett Lawson has given the green light to 200 units next to the L at 925 West Belmont Avenue, and Alderman Brian Hopkins has said yes to 396 homes at 1565 North Clybourne Avenue, across the street from the North and Clybourne L stop. We're spending billions renovating the red and purple lines, so it is a priority for urban environmentalists that the land use near L stops contributes to ridership. The huge surface parking lots by the Berwyn and Howard stops in particular should be developed with homes when the time comes to improve those commercial properties. Allow me now to share with you a personal opinion about housing. This opinion is not the official view of Urban Environmentalist Illinois, although many of our members may agree. We are, as a group, pro-housing, with the idea that when there's enough housing to accommodate the demand, the market price for that housing, for sale or rent, will be restrained. Most people live in market rate housing. Most people want to live in market rate housing, and we want the market rate to be something that residents up and down the economic scale can afford. However, I believe there must be some orchestrated affordable housing. There always will be those who can't make market rate for whatever reason, and we can't in good conscience ignore them. We need nonprofit senior housing and the Housing Choice Voucher Program, previously known as Section 8, and the Chicago Affordable Requirements Ordinance, and housing with built-in social services to help those who are stepping up out of homelessness. We cannot expect housing abundance by itself to obviate the need for these programs. Even a well-functioning housing market will not meet the demand for everyone. There are times and places where we as a society have to pull together and help those whom the market will not help. Which brings me to my next point. Where do we fall on the ideological continuum? I know we have some libertarians among us and some old-fashioned pro-business Republicans, and I would say that in modern politics, anybody who believes people can live together harmoniously in a city would be seen as progressive, and we have plenty of those. I myself am okay with a certain amount of socialism. I think there are some things we can do better as a society and get a better result for all of us than we get when it's every man for himself. Basic infrastructure like streets, sidewalks, water, and sewer fall into this category, as do education, Social Security, and Medicare. I believe we should have health care for all, like a normal civilized country. But I am not a communist. I believe in private property ownership and property rights, private business ownership, free markets, and the profit motive. I believe an efficient market, properly regulated to protect consumers, workers, and the environment and to account for externalities, is our best path toward greater prosperity. Thank you to Adam and the Henry George School for inviting us to speak to you today. I will conclude by addressing the question, what's in this for us? We're grassroots. We're volunteers. We're not in bed with the developers in any way. Many developers don't know we exist, and some have been pleasantly surprised to find out. We've never coordinated with them. We are citizens who want a better city. Chicago has a critical advantage versus other cities that are attractive to business, such as New York, Boston, or San Francisco. It is not ridiculously expensive here, either for homes or offices. We must maintain that advantage. If we lose that, we're in trouble. It would be easy to say if we're not happy with the way things are here, we should move somewhere else that's more to our liking. But you can run away only so many times before you run out of places to run away to. At some point, you have to make a stand, and we are making the stand that Chicago, a great American city, the great American city, the greatest American city, should open its arms to people who want to live here. We should not keep people out because housing does not exist or because scarcity puts it beyond the economic reach of the regular people who give a city life, especially when that scarcity is because of old fuddy-duddies who don't want change. We can't have progress without change. New, modern, and most of all, more housing is progress, and keeping it economically within reach represents a boost in our overall standard of living. And that's what it's all about.